We're starting our list with the most painful, most anticipated, and most likely the greatest game to have ever been cancelled, at least in my opinion. I'm of course talking about Hideo Kojima's take on Silent Hill, showcased only in the PT demo, that changed the horror landscape in its short lifespan on the PlayStation Network back in 2014. It all started with the playable teaser release on PSN in August that year, released under a pseudonym of 7780S Studios, when in reality it was developed by Kojima Productions under Konami Entertainment. Despite only being a short demo, it was and still is one of the scariest horror games ever made, and often cited as an atmospheric masterpiece. And that's all before you get to the ending, which reveals this was a teaser for an upcoming game called Silent Hills, featuring not only Norman Reedus as the main character presumably, but also that the game came from the minds of Hideo Kojima in collaboration with horror icons like Guillermo del Toro. It was anything but a standard Silent Hill experience, taking place in first-person perspective and centering around your playable character continuously waking up in a suburban house, solving puzzles with shifting environments, all while being stalked by a ghost named Lisa. It was extremely well received and pretty much a dream project for horror game enthusiasts and fans of Kojima. However, sadly the story of course ends in tragedy. There was a falling out between Kojima and Konami, leading to the title being cancelled and Kojima being dropped by the publisher entirely, which led to Kojima creating his own game studio and developing Death Stranding. After the sad news of the cancellation, the game was removed from the PlayStation Network in April of 2015, and although the game has been archived in numerous ways by fans, this is still the only available way to experience at least a piece of this game, which could have very well been a horror masterpiece. Star Wars Battlefront 3. While the reception surrounding the newer Battlefront games remains somewhat mixed, the originals were held in much higher regard. Personally speaking, they were my favorite Star Wars games growing up easily, Battlefront 2 being a true classic, which is why it's so unfortunate that the originally planned threequel, Star Wars Battlefront 3, was cancelled in 2008. This title was actually not going to be developed by DICE, but rather Free Radical Design, developers behind the Timesplitters series, and was in development between 2006 to 2008, before its abrupt cancellation by LucasArts. It was never officially announced, but internally was planned for a release sometime around October 2008, which sadly of course didn't pan out. The game was meant to build on the mechanics of the previous entries and expand its systems, allowing seamless transition between large-scale ground battles and spaceship dogfight combat all within the same level. Behind the scenes there was a lot of strife between LucasArts and the developers at Free Radical, including budget and resource concerns. Co-founder of Free Radical, Steve Ellis, would even claim that the game was 99% finished and just needed bug testing before it could be released, although this claim has been refuted by some ex-LucasArts employees. Eventually, a late build of the game for the Wii leaked online in 2024, making the game actually playable and found media today, despite the game being cancelled over a decade ago, even including a functioning story mode, arcade, training, and multiplayer modes. Bully 2. One of the less talked about Rockstar open world titles, but still a classic, and actually a lot of people's favorite, with a pretty strong community still existing for this game, which came out back in 2006, before the release of GTA 4. A sequel was rumored to be in the works for years. Despite no official announcement, a series of leaks and trademark filings seemed to suggest that it was very much in development at some stage before being scrapped, or at the very least put on indefinite hiatus. Although sometime in 2008, work for the sequel did start under Rockstar New England, after an outline was penned by writer and Rockstar co-founder Dan Houser. Not much is known about the game's story, other than that it would have featured the same protagonist, Jimmy Hopkins, in a new town on summer vacation. This is also corroborated by the leaked concept art of the game, showing some of the character designs and suburban environments. A decent amount of development on the game was actually completed, using placeholder GTA assets, and allegedly somewhere around 6 hours of gameplay was finished. Although this build of course has never seen the light of day, as there were layoffs in 2009 at Rockstar New England, and eventually the game was silently dropped. Agent. And here we have yet another cancelled Rockstar Games title, that started development around the same time as Bully 2 in fact, and was meant to be one of the studio's next big titles, following the release of GTA 4. The game was officially announced in 2009 at E3, unlike Bully 2. In development by Rockstar North for the PlayStation 3, and it was going to be a stealth action spy game set during the Cold War in the 1970s. Rockstar at this point had experimented with stealth in the past with both Manhunt 1 and 2, but this was meant to be a truly next-gen experience. Only capable, allegedly, on the PS3, which is why an exclusive deal was formed with PlayStation for rights to the game. Additionally, concept art leaked showing what some of the world may have looked like, but doesn't this idea sound awesome? I mean, a globe-trotting spy adventure made by Rockstar Games, presumably at least semi-open world, why did this not happen? Well, development suffered quite a bit of problems to say the least. This started when Rockstar sent a team to take pictures and scout locations for the game in Cairo, Egypt, only for them to be arrested and questioned for all the pictures they were taking of buildings such as police stations, which got worse when they searched the team's laptops, which happened to belong to one of the team members' father, who was also a gynecologist and contained images of, well, you know, which is actually apparently illegal in Egypt, at least at the time. But this was far from the end of their problems, as development would sort of come to a standstill, despite quite a bit of progress on some of the levels being made, as teams were being shuffled around and most were tasked with working on other more important upcoming titles like Red Dead Redemption and GTA 4, and eventually in 2018, they entirely abandoned the trademark for Agent, seemingly ensuring the game is permanently dead, which isn't the case luckily for Bully 2, which they still renew the license for to this day. Chucky, wanna play? Based on the horror character of Chucky and franchise of Child's Play, this was a cancelled stealth action title similar to Manhunt in development by Tick Games in 2011 and later was part of a Kickstarter campaign in 2012, which sadly didn't raise the almost $1 million necessary to finish the game and was subsequently cancelled, although in February of 2024, a prototype build of the game was uploaded to the Internet Archive, found on an Xbox 360 dev kit, and can still be played today. Its gameplay mainly consists of you playing as Chucky, stalking and killing your victims in various brutal ways while you sneak around in the shadows. Prey 2. This was the cancelled sequel of the first-person shooter from 2006, developed by Human Head Studios, not to be confused with the 2017 game made by Arcane, which is an outstanding title by the way. The original Prey, I would say, is actually less well known and regarded compared to Arcane's take in 2017. Even still, a sequel was announced not too long after the release, back in 2006. The title was once again being developed for the Xbox 360, PS3, and Windows, and was going to feature a similar structure and story to the first game, with you taking on the role of a US Marshal that crash lands into an alien spacecraft known as the Sphere. The project was eventually handed over to Bethesda for publishing, and details of the game were changed, such as it being made as more of an open-world experience, and Bethesda announcing the game officially in 2011, before formally cancelling the project in 2014. From there, Arcane would take over, and scrap any work that was previously done, and took some of the Prey formula but pretty much made their own game from the ground up with the 2017 reboot. Super Mario 128. Super Mario 128 is a name given to two different titles that were under development at Nintendo, both of which ended up being cancelled. The first being a planned sequel to Super Mario 64 for the Nintendo 64 DD or disk drive, which saw a brief launch only in Japan, while the game itself was quietly scrapped. However, the name was used again for a GameCube tech demo in 2000 at Space World Trade Show that year, showing the capabilities of the new hardware and software Nintendo had developed. Many years later, the game was still being teased and referenced by both Miyamoto and Reggie, even stating that it would make an appearance at E3 2005, which unfortunately never happened. Many parts of the game were reworked and used in other Nintendo titles, such as Super Mario Galaxy and Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess, with Miyamoto confirming the game's cancellation in 2006. This Space World demo build, as well as any other possible prototypes, are now considered lost media and are not playable today. Star Wars 1313. This is one I've already talked about a ton on this channel, mostly because out of all the cancelled Star Wars games and projects in general, this seemed like the coolest idea, and unfortunately, when LucasArts was acquired by Disney in late 2012, development ceased and this title was shelved indefinitely. The game was going to be a third-person shooter, not all too different from the standard formula for Star Wars games, but it was actually going for a much darker, grittier world, where you play as bounty hunters in level 1313 of Coruscant, and would serve as a backstory to the iconic character of Boba Fett. The game had quite a bit of work put into development, as a demo was showcased at E3 in 2012, before being abruptly cancelled. While this short demo contained a lot of cutscenes and not too much gameplay, and could be considered something of a vertical slice, the game still looked great for the time graphically, and tonally it would have been something we really hadn't seen in a Star Wars game at this point, which is all the more reason why it's so sad the game was cancelled, as can be seen by the disappointment in the comment section of this gameplay video, which has today amassed over 3 million views. Spider-Man 4. Not only was Spider-Man 4 the cancelled sequel to the Raimi trilogy of Spider-Man films, once again meant to star Tobey Maguire reprising his role as Spider-Man, but also there was a tie-in video game meant to come out alongside the film in 2011 for the PS3 and Xbox 360 generation. It was meant to loosely adapt the events of the film in question, just like the other movie tie-in games, and would of course have you playing as Spider-Man, traversing the city, web-slinging and whatnot, beating up bad guys, with the main villain being Vulture, planned as the primary antagonist of the movie. However, in 2010, the film was officially cancelled, and the Amazing Spider-Man films instead began production, with the game adaptation, of course, also being canned. That doesn't mean that this game is completely lost though, as quite a few builds have leaked online over the years, including a Wii, a few Xbox 360, and even PS3 builds, dated as late as January 2010. Despite this being a prototype build, this Xbox 360 footage shows quite advanced development and pretty modern web slinging for the time, and even some features that would later be used in Insomniac's Spider-Man on PS4. Speaking of prototypes though, this game would be scrapped and reconstructed into Prototype 2, as the game was in development by Radical Entertainment, who also created 2009's Prototype. Daredevil, the Man Without Fear. This title was in development in 2003 for the PS2 and original Xbox, as well as PC, by developer 5000 Feet, and was going to be based on the Daredevil comic series of the same name, featuring the titular hero trying to solve the murder of Kingpin, Hell's Kitchen's greatest mobster and arch-enemy of Daredevil, all the while teaming up with Elektra to rescue his friend Foggy and help restore order to Hell's Kitchen, only to discover that Kingpin was alive the whole time and faked his own death, orchestrating the entire thing. The game was initially a much more ambitious open-world game, however there were many creative differences between Sony and Marvel, who all had a say in the game's direction. There were also issues licensing an engine, which led to the game being made into a more linear third-person beat-em-up. Eventually, the game missed one of its intended release windows, before being delayed and eventually was ultimately cancelled, despite the project being almost completed, and on Halloween of 2023, a PS2 build of the game was leaked online, leaving this now cancelled game playable, at least in prototype form, which is about the best we Lost Media fans could hope for. Thrill Kill. Thrill Kill is one of the craziest and, I would say, most interesting unreleased fighting games ever made. It was developed by Paradox Entertainment and was intended for release in 1998 for the original PlayStation. Strangely enough, it didn't actually begin as a fighting game, but was rather a sports game about an ancient sport known as the Mesoamerican ball game, which was originally titled Earth Monster, before doing a complete 180 in a different direction. Instead, now the project was known as Thrill Kill and was a very adult BDSM-themed fighting game with over-the-top gore and sexual content, becoming the first game to ever receive the AO rating by the ESRB purely for violence. From my understanding, only 24 titles have ever received an AO rating, and Thrill Kill is one of many that went unreleased due to this, although an unfinished beta did leak, which is very much playable today, despite no official release of any kind. The game had 11 playable characters, all with some kind of twisted backstory and disturbing trait, and typically would consist of 4 players or opponents trapped in a 3D environment where they would all have to fight each other at the same time, sort of like Smash Bros, I guess, all while filling up their kill meter, which allows players to execute their opponents in brutal ways. Definitely one of the strangest games on this list. Cry On. Some people might not remember this, and I definitely didn't know this when I was a kid, but surprisingly, the Xbox 360 was home to quite a few exclusive JRPGs, and one of these projects that never saw the light of day was developed by Cavia and Mistwalker, known as Cry On, announced in 2005, before being cancelled sometime in 2008. It was revealed with a short trailer, and was going to be a role-playing title taking place in a fantasy world where humans use stone-like creatures known as boggles, with the game following the character of Sally and her boggle companion as they navigate the world, solve puzzles, and help other boggles return to their giant sizes. Unfortunately though, in December of 2008, AQ Interactive, a Japanese publisher, formally announced its cancellation. Half-Life 2 Episode 3. The elusive Half-Life 2 Episode 3, the last in a trilogy of episodic sequels to critically acclaimed Half-Life 2, with the final episode being planned for a release in 2007, the same year as Episode 2, only for it to never happen, despite the cliffhanger ending and unfinished story. This third chapter in the series would have been penned by Mark Laidlaw, and was going to take place in the Arctic, with the Borealis ship from Episode 2 and Portal 2 making an appearance, a gaming mystery I briefly touched on in my Gaming Mysteries Iceberg. The title was announced in early 2006, but aside from some concept art surfacing online, nothing else was made available, and the game was quietly shelved, as Valve would move on to other projects. Mark Laidlaw eventually left Valve in 2016, and the year after posted a short story called Epistle 3, which many believe was his idea for the story of Half-Life 2 Episode 3. Additionally, in 2024, a bit more footage and concept art for Episode 3 was revealed in a documentary about the creation of Half-Life 2. Zelda. This is a rather obscure planned add-on to The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time that was made for the Nintendo 64 disk drive, which was so short-lived and actually cancelled for a worldwide release itself that it led to this Zelda title being lost as well. Despite Zelda, otherwise simply known as Other Zelda, never releasing, Miyamoto did reveal that the game was completed, which led many fans to speculate on the many cut features from Ocarina of Time which could have been featured in this disc version. In July of 2020, as part of a Nintendo GigaLeak, partial source code from The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time was leaked to 4chan, including a data folder of Zelda, known internally as Ocarina 2. Danganronpa Distrust. Danganronpa is one of the most popular visual novel series today. Created by Spike and Kazutaka Kodaka, it features primarily a school environment, wherein students are forced to participate in a death game where they have to try and murder each other while getting away with it, and not being found guilty by the other students at a trial. It originally began development as Distrust, and was meant to be a high-speed reasoning game that featured high school students in a school setting, with 2.5D motion graphics and extremely violent deaths and executions, and was also originally intended for the PSP. This prototype included many of the same characters, albeit with different names and some slightly different designs, as well as much more violent executions than in Danganronpa. The biggest change in design came with the series' antagonist, Monokuma, who appears as a cute bear in Danganronpa, but in this version was known as Phantom, and was more like an anatomy doll with visible organs, flesh, and muscle on one side. All that really exists are some screenshots and a bit of footage from this lost prototype, but other than that, this build today remains elusive. Call of Duty Roman Wars. There are plenty of obscure COD games. Just check out this Recollect video covering some of the really weird ones you definitely have never heard of. But just as interesting are the many lost and cancelled titles, of which there are a few standouts, and this one is definitely the most standout of all of them in my opinion, based purely on how strange of an idea it really was. Call of Duty Roman Wars, known internally as Fireteam, was under development by Vicarious Visions in 2008, and would have been their first Call of Duty title before it was ultimately cancelled. Now, not only was this going to be a major departure for the series in terms of setting, with it not being an at least semi-modern military shooter, but rather following a group of the 10th Legion in ancient Rome, utilizing bows, arrows, spears, swords, and axes as weapons, but also wouldn't have even been a first-person game and was developed as a third-person action title. It's unknown exactly how far into development this actually got, but some gameplay did leak online, showing what at least a beta prototype of the game looked like. Rayman 4. Rayman 4 was a planned sequel in the Rayman series, and the first of which that wasn't developed by Ubisoft Montpellier, instead being created by Phoenix Studio in 2005. By sometime in mid-2006, it seems the project was dropped, and several of its features were reworked and integrated into Rayman Raving Rabbids, developed by Ubisoft Montpellier, and a new 3D minigame platformer for the series. The original Rayman 4 prototype doesn't have much known about it in terms of story, but quite a lot of concept art as well as some test animations have been found, and there are even some rough gameplay screenshots of a beta prototype. One thing that is known about the game through concept art is the idea of Rayman being able to don different disguises that give him various powers, as seen in this art piece. Sadness. Sadness was another survival horror title, which sadly didn't make it very far into development. It was being created by company Nebris for the Nintendo Wii. The game was going to have a rather unique take on the survival horror genre, and would employ black and white graphics, as well as feature motion control gameplay, making full use of the Wii's unique control scheme, such as using the Wiimote to control a torch and wave it around to ward off rats, for example, with the game itself focusing less so on violence and graphic content, and more so on psychological horror elements. Many other interactable ideas were planned for the game, making it quite an ambitious, yet interesting game, at least conceptually, as no footage of any build ever surfaced online. The story of the game would have focused on a pre-World War I era Ukraine, which at the time was part of the Russian Empire before its fall, with the main character, a Polish-Hungarian immigrant named Maria, being involved in a violent train accident which leaves her son blind, with you having to try and find a way out of their desperate circumstances. The game was first announced in March of 2006, and was presumably in development for 4 years, and even so saw strangely no evidence of its existence before it was suddenly cancelled and the studio closed in 2010. Mean Girls DS. Intended as a tie-in game for the movie from 2004, this game was created for the DS many years later, and was scheduled for a release in September of 2009 in the EU, and even later in 2010 for the US, although both of these dates would go by with no release. For a long time, not much was known about the gameplay, as no playable build of the game existed online, and still remains lost media. However, in May of 2021, YouTuber Ray Mona actually did manage to acquire a copy of the game and post gameplay of it, as well as a documentary on the search to her YouTube channel. Unfortunately, she was not able to release the ROM of the build due to legal reasons, but the game is archived in the form of a full playthrough on the same channel. Penn and Teller's Smoke and Mirrors. Starring the performer duo Penn and Teller, known for their magician pranks and party tricks, we have a cancelled minigame compilation title known as Penn and Teller's Smoke and Mirrors, developed by Absolute Entertainment. It was originally meant for a release in 1994, before being delayed to April Fool's Day of 1995, and subsequently being cancelled, despite the Sega CD version of the game being completely finished, and even review copies being created. The game itself consisted of 6 different minigames, alongside full motion video of the duo, while each of these minigames are meant to be some sort of prank or trick on an unsuspecting person. One of these games, for example, is the infamous Desert Bus, a game in which the player drives from Tucson, Arizona to Las Vegas in real time, going about 45 miles per hour at top speed, leaving you with an 8-hour in-game drive. Another game called Smoke and Mirrors is a beat-em-up title similar to Double Dragon, with enemies in an impossible mode which always one-shot the players. Another game called What's Your Sign where you're meant to enter your friend's birthday before they start playing it, and then the game pretends that it's guessing their astrological sign and birthday while they're playing. And another similar game where a player draws a card that the owner of the game then inputs and pretends the CPU is actually guessing. Despite not ever releasing officially, some of the press copies have leaked and are now considered expensive collector's items, and the game has since received fairly positive reception. Team Fortress 2: Brotherhood of Arms. Team Fortress 2 is a very well-known title in the hero shooter space, despite coming out almost 2 decades ago, which is making me feel extremely old right now, and still with no changes to the gameplay, no new heroes or anything, and no major updates for the longest time. The game is still being played pretty consistently on Steam, and is recognized as one of the first hero shooters ever made, at least with any real success. The game was actually very different from its predecessor though, Team Fortress, now known as Team Fortress Classic, which was a team-based first-person shooter mod for the Quake engine that utilized many of the same classes seen in the second game, but at least graphically, this game looks nothing like the more stylized sequel. However, before the release of TF2 in 2007, another sequel was worked on before it would be completely scrapped in favor of what we have today, known as Team Fortress 2: Brotherhood of Arms, which was another tactical team-based FPS, but focused more on realism and more tactical gunplay, rather than simply focusing on class-based weapon encounters and synergies. There would still be objectives, but the maps were planned to be much larger and would require more coordination and teamwork, as lives would be limited in most modes. There were a lot more planned classes too, such as the Commander class that could see through the eyes of all their teammates and even through engineer sentries. The game also featured real weapons as well, or at least weapons based on real guns, such as the M16, Uzi, and M249 machine gun. Descriptions don't really do justice to how different this version was going to be, but the trailers and short gameplay demos definitely paint the picture. Conker's Bad Fur Day 2: Other Bad Day. This was another cancelled sequel from Rare for the GameCube, but didn't get very far before the team pivoted into a remake of the original game, which would be Conker Live and Reloaded for the Xbox in 2005. The story, according to project lead Chris Seavor, would have started with Conker as king, spending all of his money and eventually being thrown in prison, with the first level featuring him and Birdie escaping. Besides this, a few pieces of concept art can be found online, but much of this game and its development remains a mystery. Wonder Woman. This is one of the more modern and devastating cases on this list, as we found out this year in 2025 that not only was a Wonder Woman game in development by Monolith cancelled, but the studio was also completely shut down, ending any hopes of another Mordor game, or another integration of the Nemesis system found in those games, which could have been utilized in this Wonder Woman title. After facing many struggles including changing directors and the restructuring of staff, as well as dealing with the commercial and critical failures that were Suicide Squad Killed the Justice League and Multiverses, it appears WB Games was less inclined to see this one through. The game was first announced in 2021 and allegedly already cost the studios over $100 million, just to never see the light of day. Food Fight the Game. Food Fight the movie is a lost media disaster in and of itself that I've talked about many times on this channel, and I'm sure you've already heard the whole story with that. With the original film allegedly being stolen, leading the creators to have to restart the movie from scratch, that whole debacle. Surprisingly, this strange film, which wouldn't even release until 2012, also had a tie-in video game in development by Cat Daddy Games in 2006, for the PS2, GameCube, and even later, the Wii. Footage of the game was shown off at E3 2006, and a pitched trailer even exists showing quite a few gameplay elements, which, to be fair, compared to the film at least, doesn't look all that bad. However, the game was delayed from its initial 2006 planned release to 2007, before ultimately being canned, likely due to the issues with the production of the actual film. We still currently don't have a playable build of the game, but many of the files from one of the prototypes was uploaded to the Internet Archive by a Lost Media Wiki user named Ziggy Kashmir in 2024, revealing quite a few assets, graphics, music, and even cutscenes. Sleeping Dogs 2. Developed by United Front Games and released in 2012, the open-world action title Sleeping Dogs was a sleeper hit of the 360 generation, pun intended, and just the thing to hold over GTA fans waiting for Grand Theft Auto 5. Following an undercover cop infiltrating a triad crime organization in Hong Kong, the game not only makes use of open world, but also is unique in that it uses a more in-depth combat system compared to what you might see in a GTA title. Unfortunately, despite the game being well-liked today, it didn't perform to sales standards and failed to meet expectations, selling less than 2 million copies, which publisher Square Enix was not happy with, ending any plans for a sequel which was in pre-production and had quite a few ambitious ideas, such as more online components, like an online player crime system, co-op modes, and even a mobile app that could be used to interact with the game world. From here, the studio took many of these concepts and ideas they had with Sleeping Dogs and started working on a similar multiplayer title called Triad Wars. But this project was also cancelled and the studio eventually shut down entirely. Taxi Driver: The Game. Despite being a game that director Martin Scorsese and writer Paul Schrader probably wouldn't have liked, I still find this one of the most interesting cancelled games ever to me personally. A GTA-styled taxi driver game? Does it make much sense? No. Do I still wish it was made? Yes. And surprisingly, despite no build of this game being available today, there is still quite a lot of footage and a lot known about the game, as it got fairly deep into development, which started with another game known as Outlaw Taxi by developer Papaya Studio, who were recruited to turn this game into a taxi driver GTA-style game by Majesco, with the title being announced at E3 2005, and with the company even being able to get Robert De Niro to reprise his role as Travis Bickle, the protagonist of the game and film. Naturally, this announcement was met with plenty of backlash, turning a nuanced and gritty film about loneliness, violence, isolation, and societal decay into seemingly a GTA/Max Payne clone. But that kind of obscure Hollywood video game slop is right up my alley. It would take place in an open-world Manhattan, with Travis being able to take cab fares, but also pick up guns and kill people, although killing innocents would damage Travis's sanity meter, which if depleted would instantly kill you and make you go back to the last checkpoint. It was also interestingly a sequel to the film and not a direct adaptation, with the intro of the game seemingly taking place during the film's final confrontation between Travis and the pimps. As for the actual status of the game, it was quietly cancelled, following a lawsuit between publisher Majesco and developer Papaya Studio due to a breach of contract, and to this day, no playable builds or prototypes are available online. This is Vegas. Speaking of fascinating GTA clones of the 2000s, we have This Is Vegas, in development by Surreal Software, who created the Suffering games, with publishing being done by Warner Bros. Interactive Entertainment. I'm sure you already know where this is going. Following the bankruptcy of Midway and its purchase agreement by Warner Bros., they acquired Surreal Software, who had been working on This Is Vegas since at least 2008, when it was announced by Midway, alongside screenshots and even cinematic trailers and gameplay showcases, with a planned release for the Xbox 360, PS3, and PC in Q4 of 2008. The gameplay was going to take a lot of inspiration from the Grand Theft Auto series, surprise surprise, but also incorporate casinos and nightclubs based on the real Vegas Strip, and would include a lot of gambling, dancing, fighting, bartending, racing, and other activities. Because this is Warner Bros. We're talking about here, in August of 2010 they cancelled development entirely, even after so much progress was seemingly completed, and after somewhere in the range of $50 million had already been spent on the game. This decision came likely because of technical issues with the game's engine, as well as Warner Bros. Deeming finishing the game too costly of an endeavor, given what the studio had come up with so far, and deemed the project too risky with its high development costs. Batman: The Dark Knight. Another movie tie-in, another cancelled game. Get used to seeing these on this list. But this one here is pretty sad, even though we would end up getting one of the greatest Batman games of all time, Batman Arkham Asylum, just a year after the release of the Dark Knight movie. This still would have been another cool addition to the roster of titles starring the Caped Crusader though. Like many other games based on films, it started development alongside the movie well before the film's release back in 2006 by Pandemic Studios. It would have been the first open-world Batman game, allowing you to traverse Gotham City utilizing Batman's various gadgets and vehicles to maneuver around the city, complete missions, and mostly focused on stealth action gameplay. Similar in nature to the Batman Begins tie-in game from 2005, developed by Eurocom, although this one was much grander in size and scope. However, sadly, Pandemic ran into issues with the engine they were using, which stalled development, leading the publisher EA to outright cancel the game as it couldn't reach its 2008 deadline to coincide with the release of the film, leading to losses of up to $100 million in missed earnings, according to EA themselves. Pandemic Studios shut down shortly after, and no builds have since been found of the game. Black 2. Black is a game that kind of flew under the radar, thanks to many other first-person shooters gaining popularity around this time and taking the spotlight, such as Halo and Call of Duty, but nevertheless, Criterion Games' Black from 2006 gained positive reviews and status as a bit of a cult classic, thanks to its more cinematic qualities, as well as its impressive levels of destruction. In terms of gameplay though, it was your typical first-person shooter about you fighting terrorists, the usual for the time. Black released very late in the life cycle of the Xbox and PS2 back in 2006, so its planned sequel would have been an early 360 title, planned for a late 2007 or early 08 release, with the game focusing on a co-op campaign. Plenty of concept art exists online for the title, but due to disagreements between the developer and the publisher EA, progress was slow and many changes were made to its directions, eventually morphing into something of a soft reboot. It seems development was quietly cancelled not long after its official announcement back in November 2006 by EA. However, a build dated February 13th, 2007 was located on an Xbox 360 dev kit of a very early prototype of the game. The story does sort of have a happy ending too, as in 2011 a spiritual successor was made by Codemasters called Body Count. Castlevania Resurrection. Castlevania Resurrection is yet another cancelled title that appeared at E3 back in 1999 and was a Sega Dreamcast title in development by Konami. The game was one of the first 3D games in the Castlevania series and was going to be a prequel to the original, following Simon Belmont's ancestor Sonia, as well as another new character named Victor Belmont. The only thing really shown at E3 was a brief demo movie, as well as some of the music, but no gameplay was made available, and like many others, the project was quietly dropped and the teams moved on. Years later in 2021, a YouTube channel called CVR Exists uploaded a video simply titled Castlevania Resurrection Exists, showing a working prototype demo of the game running on a Dreamcast in person, not even on an emulator. And less than a month later, on April 27th, 2021, the demo was released online and archived, making it playable and preserved. Shenmue Online. Developed in conjunction with JC Entertainment Korea, Sega announced the joint venture and MMORPG of Shenmue Online in 2004, following scenarios from the second game, with players being able to join 3 different factions and presumably take on exclusive missions. The game was going to have a public beta in China, as well as a private one shortly before release in November of 2005. However, development was slowed when JC Entertainment backed out of the deal and left Sega to develop the game by themselves, which delayed the original release window of late 2005. Later, a gameplay trailer was shown at a convention in 2006. Following this, almost no news came out, and it had seemed that after 2007, development halted and the project was seemingly shelved. Superman Blue Steel. A lot of the cancelled games on this list, despite never coming to fruition, are at least still known about and aren't too obscure, but this one is a little different, as information regarding this abandoned Superman title, codenamed Blue Steel, was very hard to come by, until a former developer and lead designer on the game gave quite a few details about the project on Twitter back in 2021. They stated, quote, In 2007/2008, I was a lead designer on a Superman game that was never released because the economy crashed hard. It killed our publisher, our studio Factor 5, and the game. I have multiple unreleased games through my career, but this is the only one I mourn to this day. The goal was to present super brawls as they were seen in the cartoons and comics. JLU was our main touchstone. We put together this fast video montage to show what everything we wanted to have as gameplay, and we did it. Aerial brawling, large urban environments, crashing through buildings, fast target engagement, knocking your foe into the next block, shockwaves from hits, impact grooves in the streets or building sides, all of it. We hadn't seen a game really deliver on that premise before, and to be honest, I've yet to see it delivered fully since. We had it fully working as a prototype, and were shifting to full production when the crash hit. All the main gameplay was in place and had been proven out. They also included multiple screenshots of the game, as well as pieces of concept art, and even gameplay footage of a working prototype as well. The video description reads, quote, "In 2008, game developer Factor 5 was working on a major Superman video game for Brash Entertainment. The game was originally going to be a tie-in for the second Bryan Singer Superman film, which never got made, but evolved during pre-production to be less based on the proposed movie and more as a companion release. The eventual financial crisis in late 2008 wiped out many game studios and publishers, including both Brash and Factor 5. LEGO James Bond. This is another obscure title not really widely known about, until a mysterious trailer for the game leaked online. The short trailer shows a relatively polished game, featuring various scenes from the James Bond films, translated to LEGO of course. The title was in development by TT Games, known for making many of the LEGO games over the years, starting with LEGO Star Wars in 2005. Most of the games typically adapt more kid-friendly franchises, such as Star Wars or Marvel, but this James Bond game would have been quite different, as shown by the trailer. Sometime in 2016, it seems the game was cancelled due to the series and the trailer in question depicting sexual content as well as a lot more violence than is typical in these kid-friendly games. Although pretty recently it was revealed that the developers behind Hitman, IO Interactive, are working on their own 007 game, so we have that to look forward to at least. Cartoon Network Backlot Party. Cartoon Network Backlot Party is the name of a cancelled project for the 3DS, and interestingly enough, the original Wii, despite the title being announced in 2014, well after the release of the Wii U. It was a party game developed by Game Machine Studios, and was planned for a release in 2015 before its cancellation. Like many other party games, such as Mario Party, it would have featured a plethora of Cartoon Network characters from different shows, such as Ed, Edd n Eddy, Courage the Cowardly Dog, The Amazing World of Gumball, Regular Show, and Adventure Time. The gameplay would have consisted of mini-games, although not all of these planned games are known about. A few are though, such as a dodgeball and basketball type mode, as well as some more with names but no context as to what they entail, known as Backyard Chase, Girl Trouble, Muriel's in Peril, Sneak a Catch, and Go Jump Ed. Obviously, nothing came out in 2015, and it seems the project was quietly shelved as no new info came out about this lost and cancelled title, with no builds of any kind surfacing online. NBA Elite 11. Here we have another unreleased title, developed by EA for the PS3 and Xbox 360. At first glance, it might just look like a typical yearly NBA title, but you're talking about a game with an alleged 1 in 5 PS3 copy for sale on eBay with a price tag of almost $1 million. But how did this happen? The game was announced in June of 2010 as a revolutionary new basketball title, and not just another run-of-the-mill 2K game. This was a new NBA game with new controls and features, at least that's how it was advertised. However, this might be the farthest a game got into development before being cancelled, at least on this list. It was essentially finished, with air quotes, because the game was said to be quite buggy, but at least functional enough to be printed on a few press copies, as well as having a demo released on the 360 and PS3, but it was glitchy enough that the game was delayed and later cancelled. This demo on the PS3 and Xbox Live was infamous for being extremely buggy, hence why the game was delayed. especially given the ambitious vision behind the game, and that it wasn't just going to be a normal slop EA game, or so they claimed. But by November of 2010, the game was officially cancelled and the demos delisted, making the demos now lost media, at least for a time. Eventually though, a few of these very rare printed hard copies managed to find their way online, and in May of 2020, the 360 demo was found and made available for download, and by July of 2021, the full PS3 game was dumped and is now playable via emulators, so you don't have to spend $1 million on a decade-old PS3 game. 8 days. Another day, another cancelled GTA clone I can never play. It's a sad day, and when I wrote that, I actually didn't know that was gonna rhyme. Genuinely though, this one looked pretty interesting. Developed by London Studio, this was planned as a PS3 exclusive and was going to feature 2 protagonists, one good and one bad, as they travel across 8 different states across 8 days. The game made its first appearance as a tech demo at E3 2005 briefly, but the following year at E3 2006, it would receive a title and a full trailer. Sadly, only about 2 years later, Sony would announce the game's official cancellation. The studio has also shut down as of 2024, and no builds of the game have ever surfaced online, although there are some early gameplay clips and screenshots. Super Mario Spikers. In development by Next Level Games and planned as a release for the Wii, this game was worked on in secret and never got an official announcement, likely as it didn't get very far into development before it was ultimately scrapped. However, it would be known later in 2014 when prototype animations, test footage, as well as screenshots and concept art leaked online. The game was yet another in the Super Mario Strikers series, combining aspects of both volleyball, wrestling, and game shows. The title was ultimately passed on by Nintendo due to allegedly how violent the game was, which clashed with their brand image. Pirates of the Caribbean: Armada of the Damned. As a POTC fan myself, this one hurts a lot, especially because I grew up playing this pretty bad at World's End game for the 360, but hey, I still love this game. Anyway, this one seemed to have much more going for it, as it was an action RPG developed by Propaganda Games, who were responsible for Tron Evolution and a Turok game from 2008. Not exactly much of a repertoire, but some of the screenshots of the game as well as the ideas presented made it sound pretty interesting. It was in development for the 360, PS3, and PC, and was going to be the first open world game in the franchise, set about 10 years before the events of the first film, with you taking the role of James Sterling, a pirate captain trying to make a name for himself. Not much else is known about the story, but it was allegedly going to have quite a few RPG elements, including character choices, a customizable ship known as the Nemesis, as well as being able to hire and manage a crew. You could also get into naval battles and steal loot from ships. This is all sounding a little too familiar. Hey, at least we got something pretty close to this. The title was announced at E3 2009, but sadly as part of a restructuring at Disney, the staff working on the game were laid off, and the team at Propaganda were left with just enough manpower to finish the development of Tron Evolution before shutting down. Silent Hill: Cold Heart. Here we have another lost Wii title. Well, it would be more appropriate to say this game never even really existed and was more of a rejected pitch that we now know about. It was planned as a release in 2007 to be developed by Climax, and of course published by Konami, with the game following protagonist Jessica Chambers, who goes to visit her parents only to end up in a snowstorm and drift into the town of Silent Hill, where the game would then, in its gameplay, make use of the Wii's motion controls. There were other ambitious plans outlined in the 7-page document which leaked in 2014, including having weather based on your area by, I guess, using Wi-Fi, and even a psychological profile being developed for the player as they played to further change and enhance their experience. The document also lays out quite a lot of information for presumably the first level of the game known as the Lake, which some believe means some preliminary work may have been done on this level, and a build could possibly exist out there somewhere, although this has never been confirmed. Many of these details were later reused anyway for the game Silent Hill: Shattered Memories, which was developed by Climax Studios and released in 2009 for the Wii. Banjo-X. Banjo-X is a cancelled remake of the original Banjo-Kazooie by Rare, developed in 2005 for the Xbox. However, despite being labeled as a remake, many changes would be made to surprise players. Even the characters would begin to acknowledge that they were reliving events, and the story and gameplay from the original would slowly diverge from there, which actually sounds like a pretty cool idea. Not too far into development though, the team switched gears and pivoted to a more vehicle-focused experience, redeveloping the title into what would become Banjo Nuts and Bolts, released for the Xbox 360 in 2008. Call of Duty Future Warfare. Internally known by the codename NX-1, this was a mainline COD title developed in 2011 and 2012, and would have been one of the first not to be developed by one of the big three, those being Infinity Ward, Treyarch, and Sledgehammer. This game was being worked on by Neversoft, known for the Tony Hawk and Guitar Hero series, using the Modern Warfare IW engine as a base for the game. Like the title suggests, it would have taken place in the future, and would feature a globe-trotting story that even takes you to the moon, just like in COD Ghosts. A prototype build from the Xbox 360 actually leaked online well after the game was cancelled and Ghosts had taken over the 2013 release window. This build shows multiple completed campaign missions and some unfinished ones as well, including the space mission known as Moonbase Assault. The Flash. Name a more iconic combo than Warner Bros. In cancelled games. This one is another victim, but one that makes a little more sense given how the 2023 film that the game was going to be a tie-in with was a commercial failure. Not much is known about the game's development, other than that its cancellation was due to the poor performance of the film, as well as that Warner Bros. Montreal was helmed to take on the project. That's 2 scrapped DCEU games, when you include the Wonder Woman game by Monolith. Twisted Metal Harbor City. Also called Twisted Metal Black 2, was a planned sequel in the franchise to Twisted Metal Black. In fact, a lot of vehicles were taken straight from Black, and the game was built under the premise of a much bigger open world, with traversal between levels being possible through highways. However, it still lacked the ability for the player to travel on foot, which allegedly is the reason for the game's cancellation, as executives believed a game like this in the post-GTA landscape would simply not be enough to get people to buy the game, despite these titles clearly being a very different niche entirely. And an alpha of the game by this point did in fact exist, and has since been leaked online where it can be played today. Steven Seagal is the final option. This is one of the weirder games on this list, and quite an old one. It's an SNES beat-em-up game based on the actor Steven Seagal, who is quite the character in his own right. The game was scheduled for a release in 1994, but of course was never finished, with only 2 levels being completed in a beta prototype, which ended up leaking online. It would have followed Steven Seagal on a quest to help rescue some guy while battling different types of villains using martial arts, with, I guess, the gimmick behind this game being that it utilized real images of people scanned into the game and digitized to make it look more realistic, similar to what was done with Mortal Kombat. Lobo. Speaking of Mortal Kombat, developed by Ocean of America and based on a DC comic series also called Lobo, this was a 1996 fighting game that also utilized pre-rendered graphics like Mortal Kombat and tried to generally follow in its footsteps alongside games like Street Fighter II, which revolutionized the genre. The game quietly stopped development sometime in the 90s and never came out, and remained an obscure relic of the past, until a Sega Genesis prototype of the game was found and leaked online in 2009, and even an SNES version was located in 2014. Tom vs. Jerry, The Chase is On. Tom vs. Jerry, The Chase is On is an unreleased SNES title developed by Software Creations in 1995 as a sequel to the 1992 SNES Tom and Jerry game by High-Tech Expressions, who were going to publish this game as well. Both titles were platformers, although The Chase is On was meant to include more combat, with Tom consistently chasing Jerry throughout the levels, with you being able to set traps or eat pieces of cheese to gain powers to fight back against Tom. Due to the financial woes of High-Tech Expressions and its eventual closure a few years later, the game was cancelled, although a prototype build from 1994 and another later build from April 1995 were both found and leaked online, making at least what was worked on now found media. 100 Bullets. This refers to two different cancelled game adaptations of a comic book series of the same name. The first of these titles was created by Acclaim Studios Austin and was going to be a third-person shooter starring the main character of the comic, Cole Burns, as well as a new character designed for the game by the comic's original creator, Brian Azzarello. The game was going to have a human shields mechanic as well as a rage meter that, when filled by killing enough enemies, would allow you to kill anyone within a certain radius, with the gameplay being compared to that of Max Payne. It was going to release on the PS2 and Xbox in October 2004, but unfortunately never got that far as the studio had to be shut down due to financial troubles. Later down the line, the project was revived and a deal was made between D3 and Warner Bros. Entertainment, with a new planned release of Q3 of 2007 and a much more ambitious launch, with planned ports to the DS, Game Boy Advance, Wii, PSP, PS3, Xbox 360, and PC. How they thought they were going to do all that is unknown to me, but this date came and went, and it would then be delayed until 2009, and all the other versions besides the Xbox 360 and Wii editions were cancelled, but from here it seems the game was once again quietly shelved. Arrow Cross. Conceived as a spiritual successor to the 1985 arcade title Metro Cross by Namco, this was again developed by them and planned for a release in 2011 and was announced the year prior for the PS3 and Xbox 360. Not many updates were given about the project until in 2012, it was revealed that the game was cancelled for unknown reasons. Thankfully though, in June 2016, a prototype build was found on a 360 dev kit, dated November 2010, and even a PS3 demo was found and uploaded onto the Internet Archive in 2020. Cat Dog Saving Mean Bob. Cat Dog is kind of a weird, little bit obscure cartoon from the early 2000s that a lot of people probably don't remember, but for some reason this one always stuck out to me, probably just because of how strange the premise was, but that was the 2000s for you. Anyway, this was a cancelled game for the series called Saving Mean Bob for the PlayStation, although not much at all is known about the actual game. No footage or builds exist online. All there is are a few screenshots, some ads, and the box art. Beyond that, there's not much else I can tell you about this obscure and lost game, other than that it was going to be published by Hasbro and was in development by Terraglyph. Deadlands. Deadlands was a cancelled PS2 and Xbox Western based on a tabletop RPG game of the same name, set in the year 1877 after a massive earthquake opens a portal to hell, which unleashes a horde of demons and monsters. The game was going to be a third-person shooter that combined the Western genre with horror elements, with the player being able to take on the role of 4 different classes with unique roles, and allegedly also incorporated many RPG mechanics as well. The title was also planned to have multiplayer, but sadly, as you've come to expect with this list, the game was shelved by developer Headfirst in order to finish another game they were working on, Call of Cthulhu: Dark Corners of the Earth. Elvion. Developed by Tentacle on Unreal Engine 3, Elvion was a title made for the PS3, Xbox 360, and PC, and was going to be a fantasy RPG, first conceived in 2003, but was ultimately cancelled sadly due to financial issues in 2008, with the studio's parent company shutting down. It was described on the official website as such, quote, "The history of the Elvion project dates back into 2003, when a small team started working on an idea of a fantasy world and game that would bring to life a new perspective, a story set in the early days of a fantasy world, a time where the elves were not yet the old, declining population guarding the ancient ways, but still a young, emerging race, struggling to take their place in a world dominated by gods and divine powers. During 2004 to 2007, The project grew and the team expanded up to a peak size of over 70 developers, and utilizing architects, painters, and sculptors, managed to give the idea a stunning visual facade that, at its time, represented a benchmark in fantasy design and real-time graphical quality. In 2008, after a series of complications, and before a serious attempt for a release could be made, the project had to be abandoned, and the team has gradually dissolved. A long period of slumber resulted, with the rights and assets being held by different entities. The title would later be acquired by Climax and made into a mashup of The Legend of Zelda and Dark Souls, with the planned multiplayer mode being dropped from the game as well. The game was then cancelled again, and the rights were repurchased by former members of the original team back in 2015, but as of now, no new news has come out regarding this game's revival, although it does have quite the interesting and storied history of development, as you can see, along with many screenshots and pieces of concept art for multiple different versions. One of the prototypes even leaked online, dated November 2007, and is playable on emulators. Cosmic Walker. Not much is known about this cancelled Wii title, aside from a brief showing at a Nintendo conference in 2008, which showed multiple upcoming Wii titles, one of which was this game, which never actually saw the light of day. Not long after, the game disappeared from upcoming title lists, and it seems it was quietly shelved like so many others. All we really know is that it was in development by Gaia, and would have had players taking the role of an astronaut exploring space. Other than that, we're basically in the dark. Necessary Force. Another interesting GTA-type game that I'm really sad was cancelled. It was developed by Midway Newcastle, and was going to be an open-world title, in which you play as a cop trying to shut down crime on the streets by any means necessary, which will actually change the environment around you as you play, cleaning up the streets and such. At least, that's how they wanted it to be. Some short clips of gameplay do exist, including a street car chase, and some fighting and on-foot third-person sections. There was also a plethora of concept art leaked for the game online as well. Sadly, the game was allegedly only worked on for 3 months, which is pretty impressive given what they showcased, before Midway Newcastle was shut down and the project scrapped. Survivor Day 1. Inspired by the success of games like Fade to Black and Tomb Raider, this title showcased at E3 1998 was being developed by Konami and featured the player trying to escape from a spaceship that's been taken over by aliens. It was claimed that the gameplay would be revolutionary for the time, with enemies reacting realistically. Unfortunately, it was just being made at the wrong time for the wrong console, as at the time, the N64 was being phased out, and so it was decided that the title would be dropped altogether as support was dwindling for the Nintendo 64, which the game was being developed for. Advent Shadow. This was a cancelled spin-off for the PSP to the third-person shooter Advent Rising, released in 2005 for the Xbox. This sequel would have followed Marin Steele, a pilot who finds herself amidst an alien takeover and has to try and survive and escape, alongside the protagonist of the first game, Gideon. However, due to the poor sales of the previous title, and Majesco suffering its own financial woes at the time, the project was shut down in January of 2006, before it could really get off the ground. Black Sun. This is another pretty obscure one, thanks to it not getting very far and mostly being in the conceptual phase, as a publisher could not be found for the project, even though a short trailer was created. It was meant to be a third-person shooter set in space, against unique-looking alien enemies, as seen in concept art. Other than this, and the fact that it was being developed by Collective Studios, not much is really known. Cyber Clash. Here we have another cancelled CDO title developed by Crystal Dynamics, with you playing the role of a hacker doing battle in first-person perspective in cyberspace, and despite a short demo being made for the title, the game was never released and was quietly swept under the rug, never to be seen again. Eurasia Apocalypse. Here we have, I believe, the first Russian-developed game on this list. Eurasia Apocalypse was a real-time strategy, or RTS title, in development in 1997 by Electrotech Multimedia. The plot of the game revolved around an apocalypse, in which, due to climate change, all of the world's countries are submerged in water, aside from a few islands, which the world's superpowers all fight over. It was known as the Russian Command and Conquer, and not much is known as to why it was cancelled, given a demo that was released in '98, and it winning a Most Promising Game award in Russia during that time. Even still, the game was canned not long after. Falcone Into the Maelstrom. Eventually repurposed into the 2003 FPS for the PS2 and Xbox known as Mace Griffin Bounty Hunter, Falcone Into the Maelstrom started as a project from Point Blank Studios, described as, quote, a blend of arcade space dogfighting and first-person gunplay, wrapped in 2000 AD inspired sci-fi philia. This title was in the works for about 18 months, and was due for a holiday release in 2001, again for the PS2 and Xbox, but was continuously delayed until 2002. Possibly due to financial concerns, the project was indefinitely shelved, and eventually outright cancelled in favor of turning what they had into the FPS known as Mace Griffin Bounty Hunter. Ghostman. In development by Widescreen Games and Kawaii Studio, and planned for a release for the PS2 and original Xbox in the mid-2000s, Ghostman was going to be a game where you control a ghost killed by the Mafia, and uses his new ghostly powers to try and save his family, fight enemies, and even take control of other people's bodies. The title was in development in 2004 and 2005, but was shelved, and eventually Widescreen would file for bankruptcy in 2009, officially ending any hope of this project ever getting finished. Only a few short gameplay clips and trailers exist now as proof of its existence. Faith and Day 45. This title was inspired by the story of outlaws Bonnie and Clyde, and even spawned off of a tech demo of the same premise, and started developing into a full-on action game by Deadline Games for the 360 and PS3. Likewise, the story of the game followed an American couple who were outlaws during the Great Depression in a cover-based third-person shooter, similar to gameplay of that of Gears of War, with the player presumably being able to switch seamlessly between characters, while also having the option for offline and online co-op. However, they ran into issues actually pitching the game to publishers, which led to them changing their vision, which originally started similar to Fallout in a post-apocalyptic world, before shifting into the more Bonnie and Clyde idea, taking place in the 1930s. Not much else is known about the game regarding its cancellation or the contents of the game itself. All we really have are some pieces of concept art and the short teaser trailer. Incredible Idiots in Space. This was a planned mid-90s title in development by Magnet Interactive for the PlayStation and Sega Saturn, based on a cartoon series created by David Burke. The game would have been an ambitious space exploration title for being a game developed in 1995, as it would have had full 3D environments, allowing you to have unique branching dialogue with aliens, multiple planets and landscapes for exploration, and even an in-depth combat system. Unfortunately, the game just seemed to be too big in scope for the team to handle, and no prototypes could be completed, with the game subsequently being scrapped. Rush Club. Similar to the Need for Speed games or Rockstar's Midnight Club, we have a racing game in development in 2001 by Wide Games, taking you to various street races around the world, located in some of the most famous cities, partaking in races against rival gangs. Cities planned for the game included New York City, London, Shanghai, and Tokyo. It's unknown why the game was cancelled, although it's thought it could be because the devs couldn't find a publisher interested in the project, and today, all that remains is a brief tech demo video. Extreme Force. This was a cancelled game in the now mostly forgotten Dead to Rights series by Namco, a series of third-person action titles following a police officer fighting against crime in Grant City, alongside his dog companion Shadow. Extreme Force would have been an early prequel, planned for the PS2, GameCube, and Xbox, developed by Point of View and Namco, and was likewise going to be a third-person shooter, following a different law enforcement officer utilizing stealth tactics to try and stop a terrorist plot from destroying Grant City. Likely inspired by the success of other burgeoning stealth titles like Metal Gear Solid and Siphon Filter, it would have utilized similar mechanics, such as night vision goggles and hiding in shadows. The game was unceremoniously cancelled due to time constraints, and no builds of the game, to my knowledge, have ever been leaked online, and only short gameplay clips exist. Cloak the Naked Mind. Here's a weird one. Developed by Sierra Entertainment in '96 and '97 for PC, we have a rather strange adventure title, mixing spy thriller and sci-fi genres into a weird, conscious-bending fever dream. Honestly, my description probably won't do it justice, considering how limited the information is on this game, so take it from this Interaction magazine article that describes its plot. Quote, "Imagine an alien race with telepathic powers so strong that none of your secrets can remain hidden from their probing. You'll find them in Cloak the Naked Mind, a new kind of adventure game coming from Sierra in early 1997. With Cloak, Sierra has taken its trademarked adventure game interface and revamped it from the ground up. Everything you see and do is completely new, seamless, and phenomenally lifelike. The point of view is first person, through your character's eyes, with breathtaking animated sequences and cutaways. Gameplay and puzzles are integrated into a seamless experience, and the story reaches beyond adventure into the realms of science fiction and spy thriller. In Cloak, you take the role of a secret agent on the planet Altopia. You've been strapped into a telepresence pod, a kind of virtual reality environment, and linked to a highly developed bipedal robot, codenamed Cloak. After you've bonded to the Cloak, the robot is transported to a trading world where humans and the mysterious alien bulbs interact to trade human-manufactured robots for bulb technology. There, you must find a way to the bulb's forbidden home planet, where no flesh and blood aliens are allowed. Your mission is to delve into their mysterious way of life and discover if they are building a secret weapon to use against humankind. It definitely sounds interesting, despite not ever being finished, and it allegedly at some point had a prototype which was created, although as of today, it seems it has not seen the light of day. Killing Pablo Escobar. Presumably based on not only the real-life account of the life and death of infamous Colombian drug dealer Pablo Escobar, but also the movie adaptation of a novel released in 2001 known as Killing Pablo, this game was taking that story and trying to adapt it into a video game, announced in 2007 by Deadline Games for the Xbox 360 and PS3. The game was ostensibly going to follow law enforcement on their quest to take down the Medellin cartel and eventually kill Pablo Escobar, like the shootout in real life. The gameplay was probably going to be a third-person action shooter, possibly with open-world gameplay, similar to another game released by Deadline in 2005 called Total Overdose, which follows a similar premise. Sadly though, in May of 2009, the company filed for bankruptcy after the failure of Watchmen: The End Is Nigh, essentially ending any development on this project, as well as some of the others that they couldn't find publishers for, like Faith and A45. All we really have today are a couple pieces of concept art. GoldenEye 007, Virtual Boy. GoldenEye 007, released in 1997 for the N64, would go on to be one of the best and most critically acclaimed games for the console, changing the landscape of first-person shooters forever. A little-known fact is that the game was being developed alongside a Virtual Boy game. That's right, the infamous failed Nintendo Virtual Reality console, and was obviously completely different thanks to certain hardware limitations. Not much at all is known about it, but you'd at least think it would retain the first-person shooter genre, considering it was meant to be a VR title, but what little screenshots we have of the game indicate it's more of an action racing game, and not first-person at all. No builds of the game or gameplay videos exist. All we have are a few screenshots and a short paragraph detailing the game in a 1996 Virtual Boy upcoming games lineup list, which reads, quote, "If you thought rush hour traffic was a nightmare, wait till you get behind the wheels of 007's car, avoid obstacles and blow the other cars away. Buckle up for safety because, in this game, you never know what's gonna happen." Madness House of Fun. This is a relatively obscure cancelled title from the Sega Mega Drive and Genesis, a platformer developed in 1993 to 1994 by Gremlin Graphics, based on a band called Madness and one of their albums known as House of Fun. The game was planned to have 14 levels, playing as the character of Mr. Smash as you travel through the House of Fun trying to find your way out. It was planned for a summer 1994 release, but never actually came out and was seemingly cancelled with no known reasons as to why. The only footage available comes courtesy of the Unseen64 YouTube channel, which uploaded 38 minutes of it in 2017. Dark Matter: The Baryon Project. Planned for a 2007 release on PS3, Xbox 360, and PC, Dark Matter was being developed by Pixel Cage and was a first-person shooter sci-fi RPG that also had third-person spaceship dogfights, involving you exploring huge spaceships and a massive open world. It was also planned to have several playable characters and dialogue options, as well as different endings, and even multiplayer as well. Clearly, the project was a little too ambitious for its time, as it started production with a small team in 2003, and a publisher was unfortunately never found, so no demo was ever released, and all we have are early screen caps. Enemy in Sight. Illusion Softworks, who would later be known as 2K Czech and would become well known for their work on the Mafia series, began developing an early title following another game called Viet Cong in 2003, which, like Enemy in Sight, was a tactical first-person shooter. It was going to be set in the near future, in a war between the United States and Russia, pretty par for the course for the time in terms of military games, that was planned to span throughout all of Europe, taking you to many different countries and landmarks as you make your way through the ranks as a private of the US Army, sort of a proto-modern warfare if you will, and probably, if it had released, it would have been very successful, given how saturated the FPS market was with generic World War II shooters and lacking the more modern settings. It was also planned to have team-based multiplayer as well, but like I said earlier, the developer was acquired by 2K, and this project was subsequently dropped, with only a few screenshots available online, as well as a few developer interviews. Shadowhunter. Another lost and cancelled project pitched by Deadline Games, this one created in 2009. It was planned to be a sandbox title, taking place in a post-apocalyptic land where you use psychic powers to hunt down and kill shadow demons. Not much else is known about this title, as the game was abruptly cancelled alongside many of the other Deadline Games projects when it filed for bankruptcy in May of 2009, alongside Faith in a 45, as well as Killing Pablo Escobar. All we really have are a few pieces of concept art, mostly of the landscapes and the shadow creatures. Zombies: The Awakening. Chrysalide is a relatively small studio of devs you might not have heard of. They were working on an interesting zombie game in 2004 called Zombies: The Awakening, which was going to be a survival horror-inspired first-person shooter for the PC, PS2, and Xbox, planned to release in 2005. Despite the team of devs being only about 15 people, quite a lot of interesting and ambitious features were planned for the game. First of all, it was planned to have about 20 hours of content across 11 levels, with 20 different weapons available and 12 different survivors. It was also going to feature interactable environments that can help or harm you along your journey, being able to block the path of zombies with objects, for example, as well as the ability to find different survivors, all with their own unique personalities and skills to help you. There was also going to be a mechanic where, as you get bit, you slowly turn into a zombie yourself, unless you reverse the process with cures. Otherwise, you become slower but more resistant to attacks. There were also many enemy types planned, not just zombies, such as military and armed biker gangs as well. On top of it all, it was going to have co-op multiplayer too. Sort of sounds like an early version of Left 4 Dead. Gameplay was revealed in February of 2004, but sadly, following this, the CEO of the company stated in no uncertain terms that the game was not happening, saying, quote, "It's been a year since we last talked about Zombies: The Awakening, and for a good reason. Today I had confirmation from Loic Barrier, the boss of Chrysalide, that the game will never be released. It was cancelled apparently a while ago, when Chrysalide realized that no publisher would accept the project as the developer had designed it." Western Lords. This is a pretty interesting idea for a JRPG created by Blossom Soft in 2004. It was planned as an Old West-inspired title for the DS and Game Boy Advance and PC. The game was going to focus on outlaws and cowboys in the southern US and Mexico in the Old West. Sadly though, at some point in 2004, the team was disbanded and the project shelved, with only a few cutscenes and screenshots available. However, the project was revived and shelved numerous times over the years, once for the 3DS and again in 2020 for the Nintendo Switch, but it seems it may have been delayed or even cancelled again, as no new news has surfaced. The Crucible: Evil Within. Coming initially from developer of the critically acclaimed title Eternal Darkness, Silicon Knights began development on an open-world horror game in 2004 known as The Box, or The Ritualist at the time. Sega gave the go-ahead for full production in 2005 and took on the role of publisher. Not much information came out about the game at this point, and it quietly faded into obscurity as Sega and Silicon Knights took on other projects. However, after a lawsuit between Epic Games and Silicon Knights was made public, court documents revealed the game at the time, known as The Box, was planned for a February 2007 release, but was later delayed to November 2008, with Sega terminating their partnership with Silicon at some point. They would then take the game to THQ to publish it in 2009, but the project was once again dropped, and not really heard from again. A few pieces of concept art and character models exist online. John Carpenter's Psychopath. One of the more interesting titles, given its connection to two different iconic and well-known movie directors. It first started development in 2004 by Tiger Hill Entertainment, a game studio co-founded by director John Woo. It was planned for a release on the PS3 and Xbox 360, and follows a CIA agent coming out of retirement to hunt down a serial killer while questioning his own sanity along the way. Not long after though, in 2005, the company canceled a bunch of ongoing projects as the studio shut down, but the title was picked up by ex-members of the studio that created their own company to continue development on Psychopath, called Titan Productions, officially announcing the game at E3 2005. This is where it was announced that the game would be a first-person action title, but also attached was director John Carpenter's name, with him coming on board with the project in early 2005. Carpenter was not only going to be involved in the game's narrative and cutscene design, but also stated that after the game released, a movie would be made after. However, despite these lofty goals and ideas for the project, it never actually released, and likely didn't get very far into development before being shut down. Mass Effect Corsair. This was a cancelled spin-off in the Mass Effect RPG series that was being made for the DS, and would have featured first-person space exploration and combat, a pretty ambitious concept seemingly for a DS title. Due to many factors regarding both projected sales, the scope of the project, and cost of development, the game was cancelled at BioWare, and the team was split up to work on other Mass Effect mobile game spin-offs. Bioforce Ape. Bioforce Ape was a game for the NES in development by Seta, not to be confused with Sega, and was going to be a platformer action title about an ape who has to rescue his human family from a mad scientist that kidnapped them. Despite reveals in Nintendo Power Magazine and Famitsu, and receiving praise for its graphics prior to release, it never actually came to fruition, and was cancelled for unstated reasons in 1992. A Japanese prototype of the game would appear almost 2 decades later on a Yahoo Japan auction, where it was then purchased for over $2,000, and the ROM was dumped online after a brief joke post showing a smashed cartridge, in reference to a previous hoax that occurred with the game, allegedly being found back in 2005. It's unfortunate the game didn't release, given how close to complete it seems to be, only really missing a functional final boss fight. Dinosaur Planet. Touted as Rare's last game for the N64, it was shown off at E3 2000, and was going to be, as the title suggested, an adventure game featuring dinosaurs, with 2 playable characters that you would be able to switch between as you explore. The E3 demo received positive reception. However, after Nintendo got a look at the game, they suggested they tie it in with the Star Fox series, which led to the game shifting completely into a GameCube Star Fox game called Star Fox Adventures, which would release in 2002. In 2021 though, a build of the original title, Dinosaur Planet, was leaked online, dated December 2000. Scalebound. Created by the acclaimed developers behind titles like Nier Automata and Bayonetta, we have a cancelled action RPG worked on from 2013 to 2017 for the Xbox One, before it was cancelled by Microsoft. It was going to be a third-person RPG following the character Drew and his dragon companion Thuban as they travel the world together. The title was officially announced at a Microsoft press conference in 2014 with a cinematic trailer, and gameplay was finally shown at Gamescom 2015, with the game being set for a release in late 2016, early 2017 for the Xbox One. Unfortunately, the game was cancelled not long after in January 2017. This one still goes down in history as one of the biggest titles that Xbox and Microsoft have ever cancelled, even though that list is quite long and still growing to this day. Fez 2. Not too much to say about this one, other than that it was the sequel to the original indie hit Fez, created by controversial developer Phil Fish in 2012. The sequel was announced in June of 2013, only to be cancelled about a month later, as announced on his Twitter, leaving a brief announcement teaser as all that remains from this cancelled and lost title. StarCraft Ghost. This was going to be a very different game in the StarCraft series, which are typically sci-fi military real-time strategy games. StarCraft Ghost, on the other hand, was going to be a third-person stealth action title developed by Blizzard and Nihilistic Software, and was announced in 2002 for the GameCube, Xbox, and PS2. The game would have centered around a conspiracy related to a military project in the Terran Dominion, with you playing the role of Nova, a psychic stealth specialist known as a ghost. The title had all kinds of stealth tricks and gadgets planned, like your typical use of shadows, as well as cover to stay undetected, cloaking devices and thermal goggles seen in games like Metal Gear Solid, and of course an arsenal of weapons to choose from. There was even a multiplayer component planned for the game. However, it suffered multiple delays and even switched from Nihilistic Software to Swing and Ape Studios as the main developers in 2004. Fast forward 2 years later, and Blizzard announced officially that the game would be put on indefinite hold. In February of 2020 though, a build dated 2003 was found and uploaded online. Call of Duty Devil's Brigade. Another cancelled COD. This one was going to be a third-person shooter for the 360, PS3, and PC, and was being created by Underground Development, mostly known for making sports games under the name Z-Axis, before a rebrand in 2008. This was going to be yet another game set in World War II, but honed in on Italy specifically, and would have also allowed the player to control and command troops. Not much else is known about the game, other than that it was in development from 2007 to 2009, and was planned to release in the place of COD 4. Can you imagine the world that we got this weird thing instead of Modern Warfare? Anyway, it was cancelled about a year before Activision shut down the studio entirely in February 2010, leaving behind only a few screenshots. Deep Down. Deep Down was the working title for a game in development by Capcom, announced for the PS4 in 2013, alongside a trailer. It was an action RPG dungeon crawler, with screenshots making it look similar to the Souls series, or possibly Monster Hunter, as the game was planned to feature co-op as well pretty prominently. It was also described as similar to another fantasy series by Capcom, Dragon's Dogma. However, this game was more sci-fi, taking place in the future of 2094 New York City, following a group known as the Ravens that are able to relive historical moments by touching ancient objects, which sort of reminds me of the story of Assassin's Creed. At Tokyo Game Show, it was touted as a free-to-play title that would release in 2014 after a public beta. However, despite Capcom renewing the trademark license in 2008, the announcement came and went and no game ever released, with not much else in the way of any news coming out. And finally, in 2020, they actually let the trademark go, seemingly dashing all hopes of this game ever coming out. Allison Road. The irony of a game being the spiritual successor to PT and Silent Hills, only for it too to end up being cancelled and unreleased as well. The game was in development by Lilith Ltd, using Unreal Engine 4, and was going to be published by Team 17 for PC, with you taking the role of an unnamed protagonist exploring a British townhouse, while being able to interact with objects, trying to unravel the mystery of the house and locate your family. A short gameplay prototype video has over 3 million views on YouTube, uploaded in June of 2015. The team initially sought a Q3 2016 release. However, before that could happen, the game was officially cancelled on their Twitter account in June of 2016. A few months later, in August, the creator would announce a new studio consisting of just him and his wife attempting to finish the game. However, this never ended up panning out either. Interestingly enough though, another game inspired by Allison Road, which itself was inspired by PT, was finished in 2023 and was released on Steam called Supernormal. Dragon King: The Fighting Game. Dragon King: The Fighting Game was the precursor to one of Nintendo's now biggest franchises, Super Smash Bros., the first iteration specifically releasing in 1999. For the longest time, not much was known about the game, other than what we could gather from early prototype screenshots, which depict a 4v4 fighting game, along with the damage percentage mechanic, features that would be maintained throughout the Smash Bros. Games. All that's really missing here are the crossover Nintendo characters and other gaming icons that everyone knows and loves. All new prototype footage would actually be found in 2022, although any actual prototype builds of the game remain lost today. Kid Kirby. Kid Kirby is a cancelled SNES game in the series that at the time was still in its infancy. The most interesting factor for me about this game is that it was being developed by DMA Design, who would eventually become some of the most prolific developers in the industry under the name of Rockstar North. This title would have also been interesting as it would be one of the only Kirby games to be created by a non-Japanese developer. Not too much is actually known about the gameplay or story, but it did appear in a Nintendo Power issue in the release forecast section in 1995. All we really have here are a few pieces of artwork, sprites, manual pages, and some unfinished levels. Legacy of Kain: Dead Son. This was created during the 7th generation era, where any single-player game was basically mandated to have an extra multiplayer mode, usually designed by a completely different company, in this case being handled by Psyonix, while the game itself was being developed by Climax Studios for the PS3 and Xbox 360. The game was going to feature an open world and would have had boss fights, puzzles, and dungeons, with the game being set in the far future of the Legacy of Kain timeline, with the player controlling a vampire named Geen and a human named Asher as they travel the lands of Nosgoth. The title was cancelled after about 3 years of development. However, that multiplayer mode that was worked on was actually retooled and made into a standalone free-to-play game titled Nosgoth, with a closed alpha coming out in late 2013 and an open beta starting in early 2015 and closing over a year later. After this, the game would also never be seen again. Return to Ravenholm. Sometimes also referred to as Half-Life 2 Episode 4, or just Ravenholm, was a cancelled spin-off of the Half-Life series, not developed by Valve, but rather Arcane Studios, from 2006 to 2007. It would have featured returning protagonist of Half-Life opposing force Adrian Shepard, going to the zombie-infested town of Ravenholm, featured in Half-Life 2 after the events of Episode 2. The game would have had most, if not all, the zombie types from Half-Life 2, as well as some additional types including head crabless zombies and an acid zombie, even zombie monkeys. Electricity traps were also going to be a big feature in the game for combating the hordes of undead. And new guns were of course going to be added, such as a nail gun, magnet gun, and even an electric weapon of some kind, as well as the ability to melee with any weapon in hand, similar to what you can do in Left 4 Dead using the Alt Fire button. Over the years, multiple assets from the game leaked online, and in 2022, even an hour of gameplay from a prototype was uploaded to YouTube on the NoClip channel, showing 5 of the game's chapters alongside commentary and more context about the game and its development. Unfortunately, the game was unceremoniously cancelled by Valve, leaving this as another lost Half-Life game. Time Splitters 4. Time Splitters is a series with many cancelled titles, the most infamous of which being Time Splitters 4, announced as a PS3 exclusive in 2007. However, as the game was being developed, Free Radical Design encountered many financial difficulties following the great financial crisis of 2008 and had to be bought out by Crytek, who would rename the studio Crytek UK and entrust them with making Crysis games, leaving Timesplitters 4 essentially indefinitely on hold. Many years later, in March of 2024, a 2008 prototype of the game would leak online after it was discovered on a PS3 test console sold on eBay. Among Us 2. Among Us 2 was the planned sequel to the deduction multiplayer hit that took the internet by storm, created by Innersloth. I probably don't have to explain Among Us to you. It was one of the most popular games on the internet during the pandemic, although not really talked about or played as much today. The sequel was announced by developer Innersloth in August of 2020, but a little over a month later, the game was actually cancelled, as the original game was blowing up, and the studio, I think justifiably, decided to just continue supporting and updating the original, presumably deciding to add planned content for the second game into the first one over time. Glover 2. The sequel to the generally positively received puzzle platformer from 1998, released on PlayStation and N64, has quite an interesting story surrounding its cancellation. Maybe even more interesting than the game itself. It performed well commercially and critically, hence why a sequel was ordered in the first place. However, for some reason, Hasbro accidentally or purposefully for whatever reason, ordered double the amount of copies to be produced, much more than the anticipated demand, even though it was a relatively popular release, but 300,000 copies was just too much at the time, and this was just for the N64, which Hasbro actually just couldn't get rid of, as no distributors wanted all those copies, making the company take something like a $500,000 loss, which today for a company of that size might seem like chump change, but was, I guess, enough for them to reconsider the creation of the sequel. At least, that's how the story goes according to one of the developers, who also stated the game was actually about 80% completed, and in 2010, a playable ROM of a Nintendo 64 version of the game would actually leak online. Telltale Stranger Things. The Telltale games are popularly known for taking certain mainstream and lesser-known IPs and making story-based point-and-click games, usually with pretty interesting and well-written stories in their own regard, such as The Walking Dead, The Wolf Among Us, Game of Thrones, and even Batman. Another of their planned titles was a game based on the hit Netflix series Stranger Things, which was scheduled for a 2019 release and started development in 2017, before being cancelled the following year after a series of layoffs and the studio's eventual closure. Also that year, in September, footage of the game ended up leaking online. THQ: The Avengers. Another lost and cancelled tie-in game with 2012's iconic superhero film The Avengers. The game was going to be developed by THQ Studio Australia and Blue Tongue Entertainment, and was actually going to be, interestingly enough, a first-person title, which isn't exactly typical of superhero games, and also, strangely enough, didn't follow the events of the movie either, rather choosing to adapt the Secret Invasion storyline of the comics, with the title being a co-op teamwork-inspired game with playable characters like Hulk, Thor, Iron Man, Captain America, and more. It was being developed for the Xbox 360, PS3, and PC, but sadly, both studios were shut down in 2011 and the game was canned. Although later in 2012, after Ubisoft acquired the rights to the game, they made their own title called Marvel Avengers Battle for Earth, also adapting the Secret Invasion storyline. Perfect Dark. As of making this video, this is the most recent case, and one of the most disappointing. Another Xbox casualty, the Perfect Dark reboot, announced at the Game Awards 2020 and shown at the Xbox Game Showcase in 2024. It was developed by the Initiative and Crystal Dynamics for PC and Xbox Series X and S, with players again taking on the role of Joanna Dark in this first-person stealth action shooter. However, this month, in July of 2025, it was announced that the studio, the Initiative, was let go during a wave of Microsoft layoffs, and the game was subsequently cancelled, leading to public outcry, lots of lost jobs, and millions of dollars down the drain. City of the Dead. Announced in December 2004 and showed off at E3 2005, The game was intended for release on the PS2 and Xbox, as well as PC in 2006. The game was going to be part of the Living Dead series of films by George Romero, the man who essentially created the zombie genre in Hollywood, and this title was going to be a first-person shooter taking place on the fictional island of Ningun Futuro during a zombie outbreak. Unfortunately, further news never surfaced, and after the publisher, Hip Interactive, shut down in 2005, it seemed the project was canned. Animaniacs Hollywood Hypnotics. Based on the animated series Animaniacs, this title was going to be published by Swing Entertainment and developed by Full Fat Games in 2003 as a 2D platformer / point-and-click adventure game on the Game Boy Advance, with characters, locations, and enemies being based on places and characters from the show and movies. The game was unceremoniously cancelled when the publisher, Swing Entertainment, filed for bankruptcy in 2003. However, this year, in June of 2025, the game was located by a Hidden Palace user named Mr. Pinball 64, and the title was made available for download on June 29, 2025, making this found media and another entry I gotta add to my found media in 2025 list. Super Mario's Wacky World. This was the cancelled sequel to the extremely popular and well-known title for the SNES, Super Mario World from 1990. This game, though, was being developed by Nova Logic, and not Nintendo, for the Philips CDI. Yeah. Needless to say, it didn't get that far into development before the project was shut down, due to the commercial failure and poor sales of the CDI console. However, a few prototype builds of the game have been found and uploaded online to be played. Even the OG YouTuber who dunked on the CDI way back in the day, the Angry Video Game Nerd, played through one of the unreleased prototypes in a video on his series, James and Mike Mondays. Justice League Mortal. Justice League Mortal was another case of a film and a game tie-in, both being created and cancelled. The movie was being directed by famed director George Miller, known for creating the Mad Max films, and was going to have a cast consisting of Armie Hammer as Batman, Common as Green Lantern, Adam Brody as The Flash, DJ Cotrona as Superman, Megan Gale as Wonder Woman, and Santiago Cabrera as Aquaman. The game was being developed by Double Helix, and while never leaking online in terms of a prototype build, it does have some gameplay which has circulated, lifting some elements from a previous third-person action title called The Matrix Path of Neo from the PS2. Parabellum. Parabellum was a planned and later cancelled first-person multiplayer game which began development in 2005 by Akoni Games, set in the near future and powered by Unreal Engine 3. It would have had a non-linear campaign, as well as a focus on multiplayer modes similar to Counter-Strike, with you either playing as the Syndicate, a terrorist organization, or the CTF, Counter-Terrorist Forces. Unlike Counter-Strike though, destruction was planned to be an important element in the gameplay, with more environmental obstacles and interactable set pieces to change up the pace of matches, designed for 6v6 games but supporting up to 32-player lobbies. The project was first shown off at Games Convention 2006 in Germany, and even had a closed and open beta in 2009, before development slowed, before stopping altogether in 2010. Plenty of gameplay, screen caps, and concept art exist online today. Attack of the Killer Rabbids from Outer Space. The final entry on this list is the Attack of the Killer Rabbids from Outer Space, which is one of the weirder titles ever designed by Ubisoft Montpellier as a horror-themed Left 4 Dead, seemingly inspired co-op shooter spin-off of the Rabbids franchise, known for being a very kid-friendly, Minions-like series of games. It was in development in 2011 for the Xbox 360, PS3, and Wii U, before being cancelled and reworked into Zombie U, later just known as Zombie. It's wild that this was even going to be a game though, with a trailer even being made for the game at E3 2011, although by this point, the project was retitled to Killer Freaks from Outer Space, dropping the Rabbids integration entirely. Screenshots, concept art, and this original trailer are all that remains of this game online, as no builds have ever surfaced.